Dish. Dessert and Dish is our weekly interview segment inviting real people to dish on the real challenges and blessings of living faithful lives. Each week we feature a dessert, and we usually like to try to have something homemade or local because, in my experience anyway, dessert always makes conversations better. And we always need a little reminder of the sweetness of the kingdom of God already at work in our midst. So I am thrilled this week to welcome Archbishop MacDonald, our National Indigenous Archbishop for the Anglican Church of Canada. Welcome. It is so great to have you here, mentor and friend to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll be getting very shortly into more details about Archbishop Mark and his work. But I also need to introduce tonight's dessert. So this is a repeat. We have had this dessert before at Dessert and Dish. But when I was thinking about our conversation tonight, this was immediately the dessert that I knew that we had to have. So we have Beechwood Donuts. Beechwood Donuts are a special treasure of St. Catherine's. And Archbishop Mark, you probably have never had a Beechwood donut.
I have never had,
You are in for a treat, but I think the thing that makes Beechwood so remarkable, apart from the taste, is just how committed they are to sustainable living. All of their donuts are 100% vegan, which you would never know because you would taste it and just swear that there is butter in there. But they are also so invested in the life of the community, and I feel like that is going to be such a subtext of our conversation tonight, is how we care for our neighbors and how we're brothers and sisters to one another. And so this was the dessert that I thought really exemplified that life of community. So you're in for a treat with the taste, and they are a wonderful business here in town, really committed to the life of community. So let's get into the dish of the evening now that we've introduced the dessert. As I already said, Archbishop Mark is our National Indigenous Archbishop for the Anglican Church of Canada. And I hope that you can just start us off by telling us a little bit about your role and what that work entails, how long you've been on the job, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, great. I became the first national Indigenous bishop in 2007, and this has been a role that the elders have talked about from the various First Nations and the Inuit as well for decades, and they saw this as a way to bring together and project an identity that was both grounded in the faith and the gospel, but also really was the Word made flesh in Indigenous life.
Wow, yeah.
And so I've been there's about 225 churches from coast to coast to coast. I have a pastoral and episcopal relationship with those churches, about 65,000 Anglicans and growing.
Oh my gosh.
We are beginning to try to gel together. We do have some Indigenous areas that are completely Indigenous with Indigenous bishops,
Right.
but we have a lot of separate congregations. Yeah. We also look at the whole of Indigenous life. We don't just stay in our churches. And the last thing that I would say about it is that we're finding that our the catalyst, the thing that's energizing us, and also the thing that we hope to be, creating the unity for Indigenous people, is discipleship. So putting, which we try to define as putting the gospel in the center of the circle of our life.
Right.
And that the position was elevated in 2019 at General Synod,
Yes.
and it's a way of the church saying, we understand Indigenous people are beginning to not separate, but to find a way to be fully involved
Right.
in the life of the Anglican Church, and by making my position an archbishop, which will, and they will be archbishops till Jesus comes again. The church has recognized the authority of Indigenous identity within the larger Anglican Church.
Well, and I think the thing that I have so appreciated about your leadership and about the elevation of that leadership is that it actually is more than full participation. It is, in so many ways, leading the way.
Wow.
And I feel like there have just been so many moments over the course of the time that I've had the privilege of working with you that it has been that from the voice of our Indigenous communities that we've been called back to some pretty key gospel truths. And I think that image of the gospel-based discipleship, the gospel in the center of the circle of our lives, is just such a succinct way of saying what that leadership has really been to me and so many others.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's good. That's lovely. Thank you.
I feel like everything that you just said makes me want to ask you a million more questions, but I do want to make sure that we talk about water tonight, and that is kind of the focus of our conversation. So that might mean that we need a sequel. We might need to come back so that we can talk about some other things.
That would be very nice.
Okay. So we've worked together for a number of years now. I am sure that I've been aware of you and your work since 2007 for sure. But the first real time I had an opportunity to talk with you was at an outreach conference in the Diocese of Toronto, and I'm pretty sure it was the fall of 2010. And you think it might be that as well, so we're going to go with that. The fall of 2010.
Good guess.
Yeah, a decade ago, let's just say.
Yeah.
And you were the keynote speaker that year, and I attended your workshop after the keynote speech. Now, around that same time, the church that I was serving at the time had gotten involved in what is called the Advent Conspiracy. And the Advent Conspiracy asks that Christians reclaim the generosity of Christmas by giving differently at Christmas. So instead of going out and buying a bunch of stuff for the people that you love, what could happen instead if we gave the gift of water? So my church was just getting involved in the Advent Conspiracy, and we were raising money for a well in a third world country. And everybody felt really good about that, except there were people in my congregation who kept saying to me, Martha, what about people here in Canada who don't have access to clean water? So I didn't know how to answer that question. And so in your workshop back in 2010, I thought, here's my opportunity to ask you if there is a mechanism for our gift giving to partner with Indigenous communities. And you said that you didn't know, but you also said that you would try and find out.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard you kind of talk about what happened around the same time that I was answering that question. I've heard you talk about this a few times. You've referred to it as a movement of the Holy Spirit because I wasn't the only person talking to you about water in Indigenous communities. So can you just talk a little bit about that movement of the Holy Spirit, and then what happened from there.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's exciting to talk about it. It's edifying to talk about it. So, just in terms of the question you asked, I began to look, and I found out some very interesting things that, as far as I know at the time, I couldn't find a single church-related charity or a charitable organization that focused on Indigenous problems in Canada. And I looked and looked and looked.
Yeah.
And the Mennonites were really committed to advocacy.
Right.
But I asked them, I said, do you have any, and they said, no, we're really focused on getting the government to do something. I said, well, I'm interested in that too, but people are wondering. And things have changed, by the way, a lot of charitable organizations, relief and development organizations, now focus on Indigenous problems, and so and I think maybe we've been a part of moving that in that direction. But in any event, we started looking at that, and that was kind of frustrating. But around that time, and I had been the National Indigenous Bishop for a number of years at this point, and nobody had called me about any kind of issue at all. Every once in a while, somebody would call me because they're mad about something I said or did, but for the most part, it was quiet.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, as I look back on it, probably in the neighborhood of 20 or 30 appeals from a number of different perspectives, all about water.
Right.
The water was and there's an Ojibwe word, mamakajuin, and it is referring to miraculous power working. And I had that sense. I thought, this is amazing. Now, they were coming from different directions.
Right.
Some people were just interested in a place to I remember one man saying, well, just tell me where to send the check.
Right.
And then, so some people were interested in that, which is fine. Other people were looking at it from terms of spirituality. They were trying to understand their baptism, but also realizing that Indigenous spirituality had insights that were important. And then other people were passionate about advocacy.
Yes.
And both Indigenous issues, but also the issue of water. I would say water united them, but also that the outrage that in a nation that arguably has some of the finest water resources in the world, that people Indigenous people would not have access to clean water, not have, many communities don't have running water even.
Yeah.
And they were just outraged by that. It was a moment, I think, of revealing to the population, and this really energized people. I thought, well, let's try to bring all these folks together, and we came together, and you were an essential, energizing part of that group, again, an essential part of it. But a lot of different people came. I think the first meeting we had close to 20 people.
Yeah, I think so.
And it's averaged around that over the years. And there was, I think, a dedication to be a kind of community, to learn, to look at these things, to work on these things, and I, of course, insisted that we always start with the gospel in the center, and people seem to enjoy that. Anyway, so we came together, and what do we do? What do we do? At that point, we started moving ahead, but it was I think, for everybody involved, something that was unexpected but very nice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I do think back to that first gathering that we had, and you naming kind of all of the varying perspectives that had brought this question together, with water as sort of the unifying factor across it. And we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, we certainly had no clue what could be in front of us, and it has been really interesting over the years. We have kind of our regulars who are always at the meetings, but then we have lots of people who, come in and then take the work out. Yes. And they don't come to the meetings, but they're connected to the work. Yes. And we have people all across Canada who are connected to the work, which is just amazing.
It is.
It's amazing.
It is. It's some levels astonishing, and not all Anglican either.
Yeah,
We've
that's
had
right.
a lot of, and that's been a wonderful thing. And that people of Christian faith, some not even of Christian faith, who've been part of the circle, but not only contributed to the projects that we've done, but also have contributed to our insights into what the gospel is about and what we're doing.
Yeah, and really, like, every piece of our work has required other partners. Like, I don't think there has been one piece of the work that we as Anglicans have just taken on together, like by ourselves.
No.
It has always required interesting other connections with other partners.
That's right.
And that I like how you said that that has furthered our insight as well.
Absolutely.
Now, despite the fact that we're kind of a motley assortment of people with a variety of perspectives on this agenda when we first got together, you immediately, I really feel, just laid the groundwork for us. And you identified 4 pillars of our work together. Mm-hmm. And you also just shared a few encouragements in terms of things to keep in mind as we went forward in our work. So do you remember what some of those encouragements were, and can you still identify the 4 pillars?
I hope I have the 4 pillars exactly, but I think they had to do with a concern for the environment. That was one issue of focus, a concern for advocacy, a concern for what might be called strategic charity.
Yes.
Meaning that we weren't just throwing money at something. We wanted to leverage, not in a sense of manipulation, but in the sense of promoting good.
Yeah.
And then we also wanted it to be tied together with spirituality, and to learn from Indigenous perspectives and life about water. And that's what I recall. I'm not sure that I identify them exactly, but those are the things that I recall that framed what we were doing. And I think too, I was hoping that we as a group would approach it with a sense of understanding how Indigenous people approach things, and that in a holistic way, in the sense that the elders say to us all the time, don't separate what you do from how you believe.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
And so and people entered in that, but also we were trying, we were trailblazing, and when I use that term, I was the Bishop of Alaska for 10 years, and trailblazing there is, you have your dog team, and if somebody's been there before, it's fine, it's smooth sailing. But if you get to an area where it hasn't been, a trail has not been made, then you have to trailblaze. And what happens there is that the musher gets off the back of the sled, gets in front of the dogs, and has to push through the snow.
Okay.
And so it is it's much slower going, and that's kind of where we were. So we wanted to move quickly, but we also wanted to move in respect to Indigenous people, how they worked and what their needs were, and in consultation with them. So we wanted to partner. Rather than to say, well, this is what you need, and we'll give it to you.
Yes.
And I knew that we were going to have to learn a lot, and that was what was beautiful. I mean, I think one of the things that I've seen, I would say for everybody, me included, this has been a mind-expanding experience.
Yeah, truly.
And I think, as I go around the country, you meet, a smorgasbord of ideas and attitudes towards Indigenous things. And initially, when we started the project, for instance, not in the group, but outside the group, there were a lot of people saying, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
And it was hard for me to understand why that. We talked to the Assembly of First Nations, and they said, yeah, nobody's doing that, but that would be really good.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to do a project that would embody what we were learning.
Yeah.
But would also embody that concept of partnership. We didn't want to go in and say, this is what you need, and here it is. And so there was an attempt. We wanted to do something significant. People were anxious to do, eager to do.
We didn't want to just talk.
No, but we realized that we had to take it slow, that we just couldn't bust into something, and then a project fell in our laps.
Yeah. So the project is definitely worth talking about. I remember from that first meeting, the takeaway word for me in that first meeting was faithful, and I think that just like embodied all of those pieces of we have no idea what the road ahead is going to look like, so we need to be on board with sticking with it. And it also like embodied that relational element that had to be at the heart of what we were doing. It couldn't be just like we meeting in a church outside of Toronto know what everybody else in the country needs. It couldn't be that. It had to be partnership. It had to be relational. And yeah, I mean, we did spend quite a while scratching our heads and wondering what we were going to do. I think a big turning point was in 2012 when PWRDF came alongside. So for those of you who are watching who don't know what PWRDF is, it stands for Primates World Relief and Development Fund, and it is it's a part of the Anglican Church of Canada, and how we again partner with communities all across the world in terms of going in for crisis relief and also building stronger communities. And like you said, that was not part of their work to be partnering with communities here in Canada, but they took a leap of faith with us, and thought that, you know, they were willing to come alongside with what we were doing. And I think that was really, that was where our energies started to get a little bit of direction.
Mm-hmm.
And so we now had this mechanism for giving.
Yes.
We now had their expertise that they had developed all across the world. But we still didn't have a project at that point.
Yeah.
But I know that there were a group of us at the end of 2012 who thought, okay, well, we're gonna raise some money, and we're going to trust that a project is gonna come along.
Mm.
And so I think there were 5 churches that first year who participated in the Advent Conspiracy. And we raised about $18,000 at that point, even though we didn't quite know where it was going to go. But it's like that little drop in the bucket did lead to a project fairly soon thereafter. And that project was in a partnership with Pekanjikum, Ontario. So I think you were part of those conversations that led us to Pekanjikum.
Yes.
How did the trail of breadcrumbs get us to Pekanjikum?
Well, again, it was Mama Kajawin. It was, I think, first of all, Pekanjikum at that time hit the news.
Yeah.
An Ojibwe community that was reputed to have the highest per capita suicide rate of any community in the world.
Yes.
And it was absolutely shocking.
Yeah.
And
horrifying.
we, a group of people formed that was Indigenous, Métis, and non-Indigenous. Some of your listeners might know Andrew Wesley, the Reverend
Yes.
Andrew Wesley, and he was a part of that conversation. Bob White, who's Mi'kmaq and Roman Catholic.
Yes.
It was multiple faith and no faith group,
Yeah,
and they all said we want to do something, and they got in contact with Irving LeBlanc from the Assembly of First Nations.
Okay.
And he was, by the way, he was kind of their water guy. Now, they didn't think water first, but they went into Pekanjikum and they said, "What do you need?"
Right.
And
yes.
they had a list of about 10 things that were critical to the future.
Yeah.
The very first one was a school,
Yeah.
but the second one was water. Because they didn't have, they had a lot of houses in their community that were not fitted with water.
Like I think 95%.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something
it was
like that.
it was
Yeah.
it was a lot. It was an awful lot, and so it just seemed perfect,
Yeah.
and it was a project identified by the community. It really spoke to all the aspects
Yeah.
of what we were doing, and it was truly a godsend, I think, and so we began working with them and trying to fund things, and they developed a project of retrofitting homes with systems where you could bring water in and use it for washing, cleaning, toilet, all those sorts of things, and so we began to do that, and at the time when we started, we raised like you say, a little bit of money, but now it seems a little, but at the time it seemed like a lot. I was impressed, and then there was just kind of and I would say over time an explosion of interest and support.
Yeah, well, I remember, fairly early on when that project had been identified, and I remember us sitting in that church in Aurora with some leaders from PWRDF, and they agreed to front the money to be part of a project with Pekanjikum, 10 homes.
Yeah.
And they kind of said to us, okay, we're going to put the money up front, but then you guys have to raise the money. How much money do you think that you can raise? And we sort of based on, I don't know, writing on the back of a napkin or something, thought, well, I think we could raise $100,000. And I just remember my heart dropping as I said this out loud. I think we could raise $100,000. And we have raised, I don't know, I mean, since then, since that first commitment,
we have raised over $500,000, and I think that I mean it really is remarkable that I have to say. "O ye of little faith" was written for me. I mean,
No.
I have a lot of faith in Jesus, but what often happens with me is at times like this, somebody will say something like $100,000, and I'll go along because I think I'm supposed to, but I'm thinking in my mind, yeah, that's not going to happen. But yeah, I mean, God has constantly surprised us in this process at the generosity, charity, and interest. And we in the beginning we had a lot of pushback. It took a while before people realized not only the seriousness of what we were doing, but the thorough way in which a number of actors and partners were able to do something that was solid, had integrity, and was of real help. And but I remember I had a lot of calls. I had to talk when I would visit around the country, sometimes mostly in non-Indigenous settings, not Indigenous settings, but non-Indigenous settings. People would say, "Look, that's the government's problem."
Right. And that's what we kept running up against. That it's the government's responsibility. But I mean, the answer that you kept saying was, they're not, but they don't have water. So, you can only pass the buck so much until you say, okay, but people still don't have water.
Right. Yeah. This is a constant problem. you know, there, there's been the debate about universal basic income
Yes.
in Canada, and a group of Indigenous bishops said, yeah, that's a good idea. And then a bunch of progressive people came back and said, oh, no, it's not a good idea. It's conservative, or, you know, it's too liberal, or it's socialist, or whatever. And you know, while people are debating about these things, meanwhile, poverty, intense poverty, continues. And what happened, we would just say, okay, the government should be doing this. It isn't.
Right, right.
So we need to act, and this is their priority. And we haven't had any, well, I shouldn't say any, but those voices have died out because I think they've seen the integrity of what happened. Yeah.
Well, and a number of things have happened. Like we partnered on that first project for 10 homes that were identified by the community.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was a second phase that we were able to raise money for, and that was with a different partner. That was with Habitat for Humanity.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think 14 homes
Yep.
received
Yeah.
water through that second phase. But then something pretty amazing happened, which was then there was a government grant to match funds.
Right.
Because somebody led the way, right?
Yeah.
Like people care enough to raise all this money,
Uh-huh.
then the government was willing to come alongside.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot of resources available for
Yes.
the next couple of phases, I think.
Yes,
So we're
yes.
hoping that Pekanjikum is taking one or another 2 phases possibly
Right.
forward with the reservoir of funds that
Yeah.
are still sitting there waiting to be
Yeah.
used.
Yeah.
When the clean water went in phase 1, there were a lot of reports about what the biggest benefits were to
Mm.
having that clean water. And I think it was Sean Atleo, the national chief.
Yes.
He went in and had some pretty profound words to say about the difference that
Yes.
that water meant. What do you think the most important?
I think you know, I recall the faces in the pictures of what happened, particularly around the national chief's visit, and it is. I was the Bishop of Alaska for 10 years, and most of the communities that we were active in, the preponderance of the Alaska Episcopalians are Native Alaskans, didn't have water. And I think it is very difficult since most people take water for granted.
Yes. So for granted.
It's hard for people to picture what it's like not to have running water.
Right.
And to have to go get your water and haul water is, you know, I saw it also in a Navajo context where most of my parishioners had to haul water for everything. Now, in terms of hygiene, in terms of health, in terms of wellness, having that water made such a difference. And I specifically remember a mother talking about what it meant to be able to keep her children
Yeah.
clean And what a difference that made. And I think the joy, and I have to say too that one component that I forgot is that the chief and council of the of Pekanjikum made the decision that none of them would
Right.
get the water, and that they would identify the neediest people and who could best use it. And that was a wonderful thing on their part. And another thing that really firmed up the confidence
Yes.
and satisfaction in that work.
Yes. Well, and I remember kind of looking at what was involved in equipping one home with water, and because of the creativity in terms of developing some engineering solutions and so on, we were able to equip homes at a far reduced price tag from what the federal government had quoted it as being. But still, it was over $20,000, I think, per home.
Yes.
When all was said and done. But in many cases, there were up to 4 generations living in each home.
Oh, yes,
And,
yeah.
You could have an impact on, say, 10 to 12 people
Absolutely.
per home. I remember the word dignity.
Yes.
And I think that was a word that maybe one of those mothers spoke, but it does seem like a basic recognition of a person's dignity, that they should have access to clean water,
Yes.
that they should be able to drink clean water and bathe in clean water.
Yes.
And just the ripple effect of that clean water too, in terms of children feeling more comfortable going to school, and how intertwined all of those needs that the community had identified really are when it came right down to it.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's hard, especially when I was in Alaska, but also here. If I drove to St. Catharines tonight,
Yeah.
I didn't have to say, Martha, how's your water?
Right.
But as the Bishop of Alaska, and also as the National Indigenous Anglican Bishop, you have to check with people whether their water is drinkable and usable, and there's various grades of good and bad, but and oftentimes, most of the time, I wouldn't have to ask, because you'd get off, these are mostly fly-in communities,
Right.
you'd get off the plane and people say, yeah, you can drink our water, or no, you can't drink our water. And I mean, again, I don't think most North Americans imagine that such conditions exist
Yeah.
within. So here you have people who are poor and desperate, whose needs are hidden by the wealth of the larger group. So you have really basic needs right with in the shadow of such great wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you say, can be so easily hidden.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk about where we are today, because honestly, you have shared some pretty heart-wrenching accounts of how Indigenous communities have been hit in particular ways by COVID, by the 2020 pandemic. And I've heard you use the word urgent a number of times. I I remember one conversation that really struck me this year where you talked about just a tsunami of grief. Can you just share with us a little bit about, we're all in this, we keep saying we're all in this pandemic together, and maybe that sort of hides some truths as well, which is that it hasn't impacted people equally.
Yeah. That's good, and I'm happy to talk about that. I think that one of the things that this pandemic has done, and in a way, the reverberations from the murder of George Floyd in the United States, they got kind of twirled together. And what's happened is that the pandemic has revealed the built-in vulnerabilities, brutalities, yes,
yeah.
and lack of fundamentals that have been the product of policy choices on the part of the Canadian society, and so on a good day, our Indigenous communities are stressed by poverty,
Right.
by need, by the things like lack of water and housing,
Yes.
and these things, and these are hard on a good day.
Yeah.
A lack of employment and those sorts of things, underfunding of schools and those sorts of things. And but then when the pandemic hit, you begin to see lack of basic medical resources. So and we're just now, as we're speaking now, COVID. A lot of our communities went into lockdown to try to protect things. Some of them have been in lockdown since March.
Oh my gosh.
But there's been, this has kind of exacerbated some of the inequities and vulnerabilities. So we've seen a real uptick in suicides, overdoses, and which I think is true in the general society, but it's way up in our communities. And then also a high rate of death, period.
Yeah, right.
And I don't have any statistics on it, but I'm absolutely certain that we'll see that one of the side effects of the pandemic was a rise in stress that led to a higher rate of death by other causes. And so, and we'll see what the next few months are going to be like. I have a feeling it's going to be very, very difficult. And I think that we are seeing, and our brothers and sisters in the United States, the Indigenous communities in the United States had the highest rates of death by COVID of any ethnic group.
Oh, wow.
And we saw a whole generation of elders wiped out in a number of communities, and elders are living encyclopedias of life, and so this knowledge is irreplaceable. But I think, and we're so far, up until just recently, the hard clampdown of Indigenous communities has helped, but it's now appearing, and I think we're going to see the vulnerabilities. So, you know, if you're in a fly-in community, with the best that you have is a nursing station that is staffed once in a while by somebody coming in. I should say, when the National Indigenous Anglican Archbishop comes, he often stays in the nursing station
Okay.
or someplace like that. There are a lot of communities that don't have resources, basic resources,
Yeah.
nursing resources
Yeah.
on the ground. And if someone got sick, you know, it would be very difficult to get resources to help them out in those communities, and very difficult to get them out of that
Right,
community
yeah.
to help. So we're quite worried because we're in a situation now where it's beginning to show. And lack of water is a significant factor in the spread of COVID.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh gosh,
Yeah.
for sure. I do feel like a question that I have heard constantly from the beginning of lockdown is, what can I do?
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and how can I help? I have seen just amazing outpourings of generosity in a time when everybody is facing uncertainty
Yes.
and a lot of grief for a lot of reasons. Here in downtown St. Catharines, we see a great deal of need. And I just can't even begin to describe how abundantly resourced our feeding programs have been, because people just want to give in a
Yeah,
way that is
yeah.
meaningful and impactful,
Yeah.
and that helps to lighten the load for those who are struggling the most. So I do hope, I think, that that people across our country are going to be on board with
Yeah.
wanting to think really carefully about how they give this Christmas.
Yes, yes.
And that's kind of a cornerstone of the giving that we have invited in our network, is through the Advent Conspiracy, inviting people to think differently about how they express Christ's generosity and love at Christmas time. And the basic conceit of the whole conspiracy is that you buy fewer presents, and but you give more. And so you give the gift of water, you contribute to the water program, and then you tell your loved one, you give your loved one a card that says, this is what I did to express my love for you this Christmas. This year, our work is expanding. We feel like Pekanjikum has their next phases of work going ahead, and going ahead with the leadership in the community. And we've been able to develop a new partner with Water First and PWRDF. And we're hoping that our work can now expand to impact more communities.
Yes.
Can you just share a little bit about Water First and what we're inviting people to give to this year?
Great. That's a wonderful thing. We always saw Pekanjikum as a thing that would help us in and of itself, it was a extremely significant thing, but it was also a way to learn and to grow. And because of what we had raised and because of where it is, we realized we needed to pivot, to look at some other things. We talked to a number of organizations, and once again appeared Water First, and and I should say that one of the things we learned is the importance of a long-term relationship
Yes.
with communities. So we're not walking away from Pekanjikum in any way, but we needed to focus on something else. And Water First was a wonderful thing. It addressed directly developing the capacity of First Nations to care for their own water systems and to have their own people doing this. You know, one of the things I've seen when somebody from outside an Indigenous community comes to an Indigenous community, the first thing that anybody says to them is, "How long are you going to stay?"
Right. Yeah.
Because there's a revolving door. It's one of the things that makes education so difficult in some of our communities. But anyway, this is a chance to train Indigenous community members how to care for their water systems, and we really liked it. We really liked their attitude and idea, and we felt, I think there was a collective feeling that this is good, this is exciting, this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to do. This leverages, in a good way, not in a manipulative way, but leverages, I think, what we give in a way that strategically helps the capacity of the system to expand, but also to care for itself. And so we liked that project, and I think it is a good thing. We'll see. Again, we want to be strategic about what we give, and we want to respond to needs in a way that will help in the long term. And we want relationship in the midst of it. So it's good, and the Water First, I think, is going to be very satisfying for us.
Yeah, I like what you kind of noted about how many threads of our learning so far have kind of come together in this next step, because that was a big part in Pekanjikum as well, was the training and equipping of young people in order to be part of the work going forward. And now we're looking at some other communities in Ontario. I think right now Ontario that can kind of be part and parcel of that partnership work with communities in clean water solutions going forward. Training, equipping, educating, all of those threads coming together, and that faithfulness part too, I think. So we really hope that communities all across Canada and all across our network will take seriously the invitation to give the gift of living water this year. And as we kind of wrap up tonight, I wonder whether you could just say a word about hope, because I feel like you've talked in the past about how you've seen an unlocking of some engagement and passion and partnership over the course of your time as our National Indigenous Archbishop. And you've said before that hope is the key to that unlocking. So where do you see hope? Where do you experience hope right now?
This is a very challenging time, but it is, I think, a time of tremendous opportunity. And I think hope is one of the energizing factors in that whole thing. And I would say there's a trajectory of hope that has been a part of Canada towards Indigenous issues that I've experienced directly. And when I started my work, of course, most of my work is with Indigenous people directly, but when I started my work, I had a lot of work with non-Indigenous communities as well, because part of what the elders saw this job was to speak to Indigenous people and explain what the larger church is saying, but
Right.
they were also really hoping that they would have a spokesperson to articulate their life to the larger church. And so I spent a lot of time going to meetings, and and they you know, I was you know, this is kind of the typical thing. I would, you know, they would say Mark MacDonald's going to speak on Indigenous issues, and I would go to the breakout room, and it would be me and the AV guy, and I'd be sitting there, and we'd, you know, and nobody's coming, the clock's ticking, and the AV guy would be looking at his device or reading something, and I would say, "Where everybody?" and the AV guy would shrug, and that was kind of it. And so I was getting used to that. And I remember specifically the moment that I noticed a change, and that I was asked. I was on a trip to BC, and I was asked to speak at a gathering of people on Indigenous issues. And you know, once again, I thought, you know, me and the AV guy, and so I got there, and standing room only. There was people in the aisles, and everybody's around. Significantly, and this is important because Melanie Delva,
Yeah.
who's now the National Church's reconciliation animator,
Yeah.
she was present there, and like she is now, kind of a spark plug for a lot of things that happened, and she has taken some of that the load of having to speak to a lot of people. That's taken a lot of stuff off my shoulders that's allowed me to focus more on my Indigenous work, which is a great thing. But in any event, so all of a sudden it began to change, and I would go to places and there were a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's because their perspective on me had changed, or, you know, I really don't think it had anything to do with me. But what I perceived as being critical was hope.
Yeah.
That in the beginning, what had happened is that everybody knew that the relationship between Indigenous people and Canada, the relationship between Indigenous people and the Anglican Church was horrible.
Right. Yeah.
You know, you didn't have to say that. You know, I mean, I didn't have to say, you know, things are really bad. Everybody knew. That was the one thing everybody knew.
Yeah. Right.
And now it's different. People are beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel. And now I would say something. I think it's critical to say something about this moment. This moment that we're in, I think, is revealing the need. Now, there is indications that, and I've talked to some people who look into these things. There's an indication that right now Canadians are very concerned about what's going on in Indigenous communities, and there's there's an indication that they want to give,
Right.
to that they're willing to share with Indigenous people in a way that hasn't been before. And so even though this is a dangerous, threatening situation, in the midst of it, as I mean, we are a faith that believes that resurrection comes out of death.
Yeah.
In the midst of it, we're beginning to see hope. And I'm day by day, I am focused on a lot of urgent things, responding to urgent needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say this is, in many ways, a desperate and dangerous time.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the brutalities that have existed in Canadian society and have been well hidden are beginning to reveal themselves.
Yeah.
And Indigenous people too. I think in a lot of our border communities, border reserves and stuff like that, a tremendous amount of prejudice.
Yeah.
And I think Indigenous people are rising up and saying we don't deserve to be treated this way.
Yeah.
And non-Indigenous Canadians are saying nobody deserves to be treated that way.
Yeah.
And we're beginning to see that a lot of these brutalities, vulnerabilities that lead to the kind of friction that we have seen are based in a kind of hard and cold policy decisions.
Right.
Not just by the government, but by other entities as well, including the church. But again, as the point is that when these things are revealed, you have an opportunity to change it.
Yes.
And again, when I started out, I would talk to people, and they would say, "Well, everything's horrible in Indigenous communities. I know that, and it's all because their leaders are corrupt." And I would say, "Yeah, they're have you noticed that some non-Indigenous leaders are corrupt?" And I would say to people, "Look, I know many of these men and women personally, and I can vouch for you. They would give up their lives for their people, but they are working with so few tools, with so little resources that it makes it very difficult to work." So yeah, of course there's corruption. That's the
kind of a human dilemma.
Yeah, it is. When I was the Bishop of Alaska, somebody said to me, we had ordained a large number of Indigenous clergy, and a couple of them had drinking problems. And somebody said, "Well, you've ordained all these Indigenous people, and you got 2 people with drinking problems." And I said, "I'm the Bishop of Alaska. Do you know how many non-Indigenous clergy have drinking problems?" People don't think in those kinds of equal terms, and so I think that we are in a moment, if we can develop the insight that comes from compassion.
Yes.
I think we could see a major change in Canadian life, and it's absolutely clear to me that that there is no healthy future for Canada that doesn't involve a healthy future for Indigenous people.
Yeah.
There is no healthy future for Canada that doesn't involve people of color.
Yeah.
There isn't a healthy future that doesn't mean that everybody has a fair chance at a livable future. And so we're at a very critical point. It
Yes.
could go south, but I'm hopeful that it will go north. I don't know if that's the right thing, but we are the north. But I think this is going to have to be a change in identity,
Yeah.
change in understanding, and I think Canadians are going to have to see how integral Indigenous people and their well-being is to our identity and also to our future.
Yeah, our future and our giftedness.
Yeah.
And I mean, that goes back to what I've seen in your leadership and in the leadership of Indigenous people within our Anglican Church is just the flourishing of gifts that are offered to all of us when we listen to one another's voices, when we listen to those voices that we haven't listened to, that we haven't treated as equal partners. We all are blessed by the flourishing of gifts. And, I think in our work in the past 10 years, we keep seeing the movement of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
And that's where hope flourishes, as far as I'm concerned, is when we can align ourselves with that. Like the movement is there.
Yep.
We need to keep getting on board.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening and for all that you do for our church and for our country and for this partnership.
Thank you.
And I would love to have a sequel.
Yeah, that's great. That's a good idea. But I think it's very important that I say, and because you would not say it, is that you have been essential to the success of all this work, and people rely upon you, trust you in a way that adds credibility to what we do. So I have to say publicly, thank you. We have many people that we work with that are wonderful, and it's we've been a community now for 10 years, so we have some personalities there. It's an interesting group, but you have been a stellar part of it in the sense that I just don't think we would be here if it hadn't been for your contribution, which is not easy to do when you are a wife, a mom, and a rector all at the same time. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.